Investment executive Louise Gallagher had no intentions of mixing work and play in August of 1998. The 44-year-old single mother from Calgary, Canada, knew what her priorities were.
I had two amazing young daughters, Alexis and Lizanne, who were 12 and 10 years old, and I really needed to focus on them.
But her attention shifted that fall when a new client pulled up on the scene.
It was the company that manufactured kit cars. And I had gone to talk to this company that was looking to go public.
And when Louise met the company's senior partner, 45-year-old Conrad Cheney, she was instantly charmed.
When I first met Conrad, I shook his hand, and, I had that sense that I'd met him before. And I said,
"We met before? You look really familiar."
He looked deeply into my eyes and said, "Oh no, if we'd ever met before, I'd never have let you go." And I thought, ooh, wow, that's quite the line.
When Louise told me about meeting this wonderful man, she described it to me as almost a magnetic force. She was mesmerized by him.
So when Conrad asked Louise out on an official date, she decided it couldn't hurt to mix a little pleasure with business.
We went to one of my favorite restaurants, and Conrad was really charming. He spent a lot of time telling me how beautiful I am. The flattery was a little overwhelming, but I couldn't deny my attraction to him.
But as Louise blushed, Conrad suddenly turned pale.
Midway through the dinner, suddenly Conrad got really shaky and started to have, belabored breathing. I had no idea what was going on. He got up from the table and made a phone call, and then two guys from his plant came and they left. I was feeling really unnerved. To disappear like that, it's very strange.
Several days passed before Louise finally heard from Conrad, and his explanation created more questions than answers.
Conrad called and told me that he had been quite ill. I asked him what it was, but he wouldn't talk about it. It was clearly distressing him. I was definitely worried about him.
Over the next few weeks, however, Louise's concerns were overshadowed by Conrad's charm.
Conrad was the ultimate romantic. He sent this huge bouquet of flowers one day with a note that just said, "From one of your greatest admirers." So I was falling hard for him.
I thought he was really charismatic. I could tell my mom was genuinely falling for this man, and so to see her find someone was really exciting for us.
After 3 months of dating, Conrad treated Louise to a spontaneous weekend getaway. And the surprises didn't stop there.
We got there and were at dinner, and he pulled a ring out of his pocket. I mean, it was stunningly beautiful. I was shocked. And I said, "This is way too soon. We need to just take this slowly. There's all the time in the world."
That's when Conrad made a dire confession.
He said, "I have a heart condition. If I don't take care of it,
I'll be dead by Christmas."
Just a couple of months away. I was stunned. I couldn't believe that here's my Prince Charming and he's gonna die.
Conrad told Louise the only thing that could save him was an experimental surgery in California. So that night, Louise accepted Conrad's marriage proposal.
I didn't know if he would survive this surgery. But how could I say no to a man who loves me so deeply and needs me? I felt that I had to do this for him.
But Conrad's heart wasn't the only thing in trouble. And before long, Louise would find herself drawn into a dark underworld that she couldn't escape.
Louise had no idea what or who was out there, and she was terrified.
We were blindsided when things began to unravel.
I was in too deep, and it wasn't going to stop until they had what they wanted.
In the winter of 1998, Louise Gallagher was devastated to learn from her fiancé, Conrad Cheney, that he had a rare heart disease and his time was running out.
Conrad told me that he had 3 months to live. Needless to say, I wanted to spend every moment with him that I could.
But according to Conrad, with a risky surgery scheduled in the coming weeks, he was too busy to spend much time with Louise. Still, Conrad was there for Louise when it mattered most. When she needed knee surgery that November, it was Conrad who came to her rescue.
When I was released from the ER, Conrad was right there to pick me up. But as I got in the car, I saw him pick something heavy off the front seat and move it into the back seat. I thought it was a gun. When I mentioned it to him, he reassured me that it was just a toy. And it was something left over from his daughter's Halloween event or something. I laughed at myself because that was just really weird of me to even think that.
After spending New Year's Day together, Louise said a sad goodbye to Conrad as he left for his surgery.
I'd asked if I could go to California to be there, but he said that that wouldn't be a good thing because he needed to conserve his energy. So I remember feeling so lost because I knew he may or may not survive.
Finally, 4 days later, Louise received a call, but it wasn't from Conrad.
It was his associates calling me to say that they believed it was a success. They said he wasn't able to talk. They were trying to keep him really quiet and calm.
She was relieved that he'd made it through the surgery, but still very frustrated to be here in Calgary. She really wanted to be there with him.
So Louise was overjoyed when her fiancé returned the following month and said he was fully recovered.
I was just ecstatic to be with him. But I must admit, he looked really healthy for a guy who'd had this crazy, risky surgery. But I just decided to let it go.
But what Louise couldn't let go was the feeling she was inching closer to the bottom of Conrad's priority list.
Conrad was always too tired from recovering or too busy catching up at work. And I began to feel more pushed to the side.
Louise's feelings of doubt were replaced with dread when Conrad gave her some crushing news.
I was sound asleep and the phone rang. It was about 1:30 in the morning. And I answered the phone, and all I could hear was Conrad crying.
Sorry, Louise. I'm sorry. Are you all right?
And what Conrad said next would force Louise into a prison of fear and paranoia that would change her life forever.
It was like a living hell for her.
When he said those words, it was like someone kicked the air right out of me.
In February of 1999, Louise Gallagher received a frantic phone call from her fiancé, Conrad Cheney, that turned her entire world upside down.
All he would say was, "I'm so sorry, I've put you in harm's way."
Sorry, Louise. I'm sorry.
And he told me that he was part of an organized crime family and that they had discovered his love for me. I was stunned. I couldn't believe that it was true.
According to Conrad, his mafia family was angry that he was in love with someone outside their trusted circle.
Oh my God.
After all, with pillow talk comes loose lips.
I didn't have any secrets to share, but Conrad would say they don't believe that. And he said he had received an envelope, and in the envelope there were 3 bullets, and one for me and one for each of my daughters. It was a warning that we were in danger. I just remember this feeling of being absolutely terrified.
Louise thought a call to the police was their only hope, but Conrad had other plans.
He said, if you go to the police, they will know. And that's what would trigger them to kidnapping the girls.
Terrified and unable to sleep that night, Louise thought back to her relationship with Conrad. And suddenly, all the pieces came together.
The gun made sense. I just thought to myself, oh my God, it must not have been a toy gun at all. So I was angry with myself because I put my daughters in this situation. And it was all my fault. And I didn't know what to do.
To keep her daughters safe, Louise kept the mafia threat to herself, but slowly the secret ate away at her.
This was not something I felt that they needed to carry, so I had to pretend like everything was just fine.
But soon after, the threats against Louise seemed to become a reality.
One day, one of my neighbors came over and she said, I saw somebody sneaking around your car. And I phoned Conrad, and he immediately sent his associates over to look for bombs under the car. They never found anything, but it was just this constant, unsettling fear.
Louise's only peace of mind was that Conrad had her followed everywhere for her protection.
I thought it was scary and unsettling, but he had had me followed, and he always knew where I was. But he was protecting me and my daughters.
Later that summer, the stress of the situation caused Conrad's health to take another grim turn.
I got a phone call from one of his associates saying that Conrad was in California in hospital and that they were going to put him on life support system. Part of my mind went to this place that said, Conrad is protecting me and my daughters, and as long as Conrad is alive, then my daughters are safe. But if he died, I just didn't know what was going to happen. I was terrified.
Within days of learning of Conrad's condition, Louise ran into a friend at a local coffee shop. Alone and afraid, she broke down and told him about her fiancé in a coma in California.
My friend agreed he wouldn't tell anyone, but a few days later, I received a phone call from a woman who was a friend of my friend, and she just said, my daughter Rebecca is talking to a man on life support in California as well, and his name is Conrad. And I thought, no, that can't be.
Flooded with emotions, Louise arranged to meet the woman that very day at her home and discovered Rebecca's Conrad and her Conrad were one and the same.
She just broke down, and I just got really angry. It was like someone stabbed me in the heart, and I was in shock.
Enraged, the two women immediately drove to Conrad's office to demand information on his condition and whereabouts. And what they found was appalling.
We walked straight into Conrad's office, and sure enough, there he was, sitting behind his desk. He should be on life support, but he's not. He's sitting there. Rebecca just started yelling at him. Like, I was just absolutely speechless.
Louise may have been at a loss for words, but Conrad wasn't.
He said that he'd lied about being on life support to protect us. He hoped it would somehow shake the mafia off of his trail. He had started seeing Rebecca in the hopes that it would take the mafia's attention off of me. That it didn't change the fact that he was cheating, and I was devastated. Conrad said that he was going to end everything with Rebecca and reminded me of what could happen if I broke up with him.
If Louise walked away and then something happened to one of her daughters, she'd never forgive herself. She couldn't take that chance.
Conrad told Louise he ended it with Rebecca, and for the next 3 years, Louise stayed under Conrad's thumb, always fearful of when his mafia family would make their move.
My sister and I realized that Conrad was toxic.
You have to break up with him.
It was really clear that she had no intention of leaving him, so we went to live with my dad.
That was the moment my heart just broke. They didn't know I was only staying with Conrad for their own protection. That was best for them that they stay with their dad, because with me, they would be in danger.
By January 2003, the strain and threats were becoming too much. So Conrad came up with a solution. The couple would steal away in the middle of the night to the Canadian countryside, where no one, not even the mafia, could find them.
All I could think of was that I had to get him away from the people I loved. So I just went with him.
But soon Louise would discover that the mafia was the least of her worries. There was something much closer and much more dangerous to fear.
She had no idea what Conrad had in store for her. She never saw it coming.
My biggest fear was that I'd never be able to tell her that I still loved her.
I remember thinking, he's gonna kill me. Today's the day.
In the spring of 2003, Louise Gallagher was convinced that she and her fiancé, Conrad Cheney, would be safe from the mafia by hiding out in the Canadian wilderness.
For 3 months, we stayed in a bed and breakfast out in the country. But Conrad was acting so different. He would scream and he would remind me of how all of it was my fault. I was just terrified. I just thought he was going to kill me because he had to get rid of me. And I kept waiting for him to do it.
After almost 4 months of hiding, they had some unexpected visitors.
I was in a panic. I thought the police were going to tell me that something had happened to my daughters and that this, all of it, had been for nothing.
Louise was shocked and relieved to learn that it wasn't her daughters that were in trouble. It was Conrad.
They had a warrant and they started to read off the list of charges and they told him he was under arrest. And I thought, who is this man?
Conrad wasn't wanted by the mafia. He was wanted by the law for charges of breaking and entering, fraud, and forgery. And thanks to Louise's loved ones, police were able to track him down.
When Louise vanished, we had a sense of the peril she was in. So we went to the police and we told them that we knew she was with Conrad.
The police had warrants out for Conrad's arrest, so they knew that if they found Louise, then they would find Conrad. So they managed to track Louise down through a check that she had written.
And when they did, Louise was dumbfounded to find that nothing about her fiancé was as it seemed.
Conrad presented this image of a very, very successful business when in fact it was crumbling. It was close to bankruptcy. And that's what led him to open cell phone accounts in his daughter's name. He had purchased a car in his aunt's name, and they filed charges against Conrad.
This lightning bolt hit me, and it wasn't until then that I realized just how deeply rooted Conrad's lies were.
It turned out Conrad wasn't just broke and a fraud. He was a cheat and a stalker as well.
Conrad told Louise he was going to break up with Rebecca, but he kept seeing her. She tried to break up with him. He didn't like that, so he began stalking Rebecca, harassing her. He broke into her home, and she had him charged for that.
Police took Conrad into custody, and Louise's family brought her back to safety and to her daughters.
My sisters and my mom had flown them out to Vancouver to see me. And it was so magical. Alexis and Lisanne are the reason I'm alive today.
I don't think I could put into words how much I love my mom and how thankful I am that she made it through.
With Conrad behind bars, Louise learned the truth from police and finally realized she was just a pawn in his sick game.
The only heart condition Conrad ever had was that he didn't have a heart. He was not part of an organized crime family. There were not these evil men waiting out there willing to kidnap the girls. Everything he told me was a lie. I felt used and I felt empty and I felt devastated.
In July of 2003, Conrad Cheney pled guilty to fraud, forgery, and breaking and entering. He was sentenced to 2 years, 1 month, and 26 days in federal prison.
This wasn't about a love affair gone bad. It was about abuse. I didn't believe evil existed, but I believe evil does exist now.
Today, Louise has healed from her experience, and she's stronger than ever.
I have gained back my self-respect, and I've gained my daughters back. And we have a relationship that is stronger and is filled with love and caring.
The light is definitely back in my mom's eyes, and I don't think that there will ever be anything that could extinguish that again.
I can't stop an abuser being who they are, but I can't stop their abuse of my life. Nothing can destroy me as long as I stand true to me.
In the fall of 1999, 30-year-old Texan Christy Smith couldn't deny that after 10 years of marriage, the magic was missing.
There was no excitement, there was no passion. So all of a sudden I found myself separated with a 13-year-old and an 8-year-old. But I was very excited to start dating, to get back out there.
So it seemed fortuitous when that October, she and her best friend Crystal ran into an old high school friend, Randy Cooper, at a local bar in Fort Worth.
I had a very big crush on Randy when we were in high school, and I just thought he was gorgeous.
So when Randy mentioned that he was recently divorced, he had Christy's full attention.
Randy was working odd jobs, just anything to make money. But he was just as gorgeous as I remember.
As the three friends reconnected, however, it seemed Randy had his eyes set on Crystal.
Randy was attractive, and he was so funny. So I decided to go ahead and give him a chance to go ahead and go out with him.
I would have wished it was me, but it was fun being around him. After the night we met, we became very good friends.
But the following week, after one date with Randy, Crystal decided he wasn't the man for her.
I met him at a restaurant, and within 5 minutes of him telling me that he was in prison,
Don't worry about it.
I thought, this man is weird and crazy. I told Christy that I knew that this was not a man I would ever date.
She just thought he was too wild. And Randy would tell me stories that just seemed unreal. I wasn't really surprised because I really knew Crystal and that he wouldn't be her type. But it didn't bother me at all. It actually intrigued me. Bye.
So when Christy dropped by Randy's house a few weeks later, she was excited when he hinted that he wanted more than a friendship.
Crystal just doesn't get my humor.
He said, but you do. He said, and we have so much fun together. He was interested in actually dating me. I was just on cloud nine.
Over the next month, Christy began seeing Randy regularly, despite her friends' disapproval.
The more I tried to get Christy to stay away from Randy, the closer they got. So I did not hang out with Christy while they were together.
Randy always said Crystal's just jealous. It bothered me when Crystal would talk about Randy because I was crazy in love. We had so much fun together.
But the icing on the cake was seeing how great Randy was with her kids.
Randy was fun to be around. He would spend time with us, not just my mom. He would tell us jokes and would always cut up with us.
He even kept Christy entertained with his over-the-top storytelling.
One morning, Randy said, have you ever heard of Possum and Snake? And I said, no. So he told me that a possum comes up and there's a snake by the river.
And the snake's cold.
Tells the possum, will you please let me in your pouch to get warm? If you'll help me, I won't bite you. So the possum lets him in his pouch, gets him across the river.
And as soon as he does, the snake curls up, struts. And the possum says, wait a minute, I thought you were gonna hurt me. The snake says, I'm a snake, stupid. What did you think?
Then the snake struck the possum and killed it. I had no idea why Randy told me that story. I just didn't get it. But Randy kept me on my toes. And I loved it, every bit of it.
So after 2 months of dating, when Randy asked her if he could move in, Christy was ecstatic.
We always wanted to be together, and the children seemed to really like him. And so he moved in. I was a really lucky girl.
But Christy had no idea her luck was about to run out when Randy's wild imagination would become her terrifying reality.
His behavior had changed so drastically.
He had a plan and nothing was going to stop him.
I saw the joy he took in causing pain. He was just evil.
In February of 2000, Christy Smith had been separated from her husband for 1 year when her new boyfriend, Randy Cooper, moved in with her and her 2 kids.
My ex-husband did want me back, and he was very upset about Randy living in the house. But I was so happy to have everyone I loved under one roof. When I was with Randy, I felt like nothing in the world could harm me. Nothing.
But a week later, Christy became troubled when Randy made an odd discovery.
So I go out in the garage, and he's got a handful of, like, empty chip wrappers, empty candy bar wrappers.
What is this?
He said he had found them all in the attic.
There's piles of this stuff.
He said, it almost looks like somebody could be staying in the attic. I thought, oh no, that's crazy. There's no way. So I just kind of, blew it off.
Then the following week, Randy came home with more disturbing news.
Randy said that my ex-husband had followed him home.
He was wearing a disguise in the car.
And he was wearing some type of disguise. I was shocked. I was like, there's no way. My ex had not a mean bone in his body. But Randy insisted it was my ex-husband. So I asked my ex, you're not parking at the end of the street, are you? And he said, no, why would I do that? So I thought Randy was just blowing this all out of proportion because he had a very wild imagination.
Christy was starting to seriously worry about her boyfriend.
He started getting a lot more irritated about things, like if the children left the lights on, he would take the light bulb out.
You turn the lights off.
I thought it was really weird for doing something innocent, like leaving the lights on. It seemed like his mood would change at the drop of a dime.
Don't do it again.
He just wasn't the happy-go-lucky Randy that I was used to. I was worried that I had just fallen for the fairy tale and that it just wasn't going to work.
But on Valentine's Day, her concerns soon subsided when Randy's doting nature returned.
My ex-husband had taken the kids for the whole week, so Randy would just do romantic things. I got my old Randy back again.
And on February 23rd, nothing would top Randy's display of affection.
We had went to the bar, and we had got there. He looked at me and said,
Today's gonna be a special day.
he gave me a kiss, and he walked up onto the stage, and he said,
Hey, I'm gonna need everybody's attention.
I have found the love of my life.
Christy, come on up here.
And he said, Christy, will you marry me? I was just so excited. It was so unexpected. And I said yes, of course. And he just seemed like he was on cloud nine.
The lovebirds ordered a round of drinks for all, and the celebration began. But the excitement quickly caught up to Christy.
I told Randy, I said, my head was spinning, and I started having problems with my stomach. And he said, well, let's get you home, babe.
When they arrived, Randy gently led her to the bedroom.
Said, well, go on in and put on something cute and lay down, and he would bring me some aspirin. So I went in and put on a negligee. I was trying to stay awake, and I guess I kind of dozed off a little bit.
Moments later, Christy awoke to an unrecognizable voice.
Wake up, bitch! I thought you were my angel, but you're just a lying whore!
After her boyfriend proposed on February 23, 2000, Christy Smith dozed off peacefully, but woke up in a nightmare.
Wake up, bitch! I'm gonna torture you. You're gonna wish you were dead.
And he said, you're gonna know pain like you've never felt pain.
I thought you were my angel.
Then he reached over and he punched me in the face. And I was just shocked.
Before Christy could even react, Randy grabbed a bat.
he hit me in the head with a bat. And I kept putting my hands over my head. And he said, better put them hands down. And I started screaming, and I kept asking him why. Randy said I kissed a male friend of mine at a time before me and him had started dating. And he told me that he was going to torture me until he knew the truth.
Did you kiss him?
What he was asking didn't make sense. Why would he care if I kissed this man before we dated? And I said, I love you, Randy. I would never cheat on you. And he said that that was a lie. And then he doubled up his fist and he hit me.
You're lying to me!
The pain was unreal. And my face was bleeding. And I kept telling him I didn't do it. But I'll tell you I did. If you'll just stop. Just stop. And he just laughed and swung again. Then he choked me till I was consciousness. And I woke up, and he was slapping me in the face. And he said, you're not getting away that easy. I thought Randy was going to kill me.
Randy was unrelenting as he continued to torture Christy over the next several hours.
There were tools on the dresser. And he picked up this belt buckle. And he hit me from head to toe. He picked up the wire cutters and the pliers, and he started to cut my nipples off. It was just the most unbelievable pain.
Then Randy suddenly paused to show Christy his handiwork. Just as hope seemed lost, Christy's thoughts turned to her children.
I loved my kids too much, but I was not gonna let him win. I was not. I had to be there for my babies. In that moment, I knew that if I didn't make it to that phone, that there was no hope. And the thought came to me, I told Randy, let's just try to call my friend, that guy that you were accusing me of kissing, and he'll tell you the truth. He'll tell you if I kissed him or not. And he said, if you can't make it into the kitchen, you're not going to have any idea what pain is.
Christy crawled to the kitchen to get to the phone.
And as soon as I got a dial tone, I called 911.
911, what's your emergency? Hello, are you there? Hello?
On February 24th, 2000, after suffering hours of unimaginable torture at the hands of her fiancé, Randy Cooper, Christy Smith could only hope her attempt to call 911 had worked.
I didn't know if I got through or not, but Randy was screaming he was going to kill me before anybody could get there.
Seconds later, 911 made a routine follow-up call.
Hello? Hello? No, actually my son did. Yeah, well, actually, I picked up the telephone.
Then I just screamed like nobody's ever screamed. And he hung up the phone, he started screaming at me. I told him, just take my car, just go. I don't care, just go.
As Randy searched for her keys, Christy made it to the bathroom.
I got the window open, and I got the door locked. And that's all I had left. The pain was just so overwhelming.
Two patrol officers were dispatched. When the officers pulled up, Randy was walking out the front door.
They noticed that he had blood on his clothing and blood on his hands, and he kept trying to tell the officers that children had made the 911 call.
They might have been playing with the phone, you know.
But they heard faint screams coming from within the house. Officers detained Randy outside, and the other officers made their way into the house.
Police discovered Christy barely conscious.
Randy's trying to kill me.
She was bloody and bruised, and she was telling them that Randy was trying to kill her. She had significant injuries. Something horrible had gone on in the home. I haven't seen any assault like that ever. Randy told the officers that Christy had come home in that condition, but it was obvious to officers that a disturbance had gone on there. They found blood in the bedroom, ball bats, a hammer, pliers, apparently items that Randy had used on Christy at the time. From that point forward, Randy would no longer speak to the police and ask for an attorney.
Randy Cooper was immediately arrested while Christy was rushed to the nearest hospital.
Christy had skull fractures, a broken jaw, broken teeth. She had a broken arm and significant bruising and cuts all up and down her body. I was amazed that she was still alive.
I knew that Randy was crazy, but I didn't think anybody could ever be that evil or how anybody could do that to another person.
It was really horrifying to find out what happened. I talked to my mom on the phone while she was in the hospital. She told us that everything was okay and that she'd be home.
While awaiting Randy's trial over the next 2 years, Christy healed physically, but emotionally she was still suffering.
I remember just still being in shock. It didn't make any sense how he could hurt me that bad. Because I loved him completely and with all my heart.
On July 9th, 2002, Randy Cooper pled not guilty to the charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon.
At the trial, I learned that Randy's ex-wife had been beaten repeatedly. He had been very threatening to women for years and years.
I would describe Randy's actions as sociopathic, especially given light that he tried to lie to officers. I believe if Randy had actually killed Christy, that later down the road, other people would be in his crosshairs as well.
Christy couldn't help but wonder if Randy had been planning the attack all along.
There was no real reason behind what he did because he thought I kissed a male friend of mine. It was like he was grasping at a reason to hurt me. I believe Randy was trying to set up my ex-husband from the very beginning. I think he saw that there was a possible way to kill someone and get away with it. I think that the whole time he had been planning to torture me.
And now she understood why Randy might have chosen her instead of her best friend.
I think he saw me as an easy mark because I was trusting. All I kept thinking is how I could have been so gullible, how I could have been so wrong.
On July 11th, 2002, Randy Cooper was found guilty and sentenced to 99 years in prison.
I loved him so much, and I would have done anything except die for him. Randy won the battle, but I won the war because I lived.
Today, after countless surgeries, Christy still suffers a great deal from her injuries.
I have my good days and my bad days. I have to deal with unbelievable pain. And it is a limited life that I have, but at least I have one.
It's going to be a struggle for her the rest of her life. But the motivating drive for Christy during this whole ordeal has been her children. That keeps her motivated.
In hindsight, Christy finally understands what Randy meant by the possum and the snake story.
That was one of the main red flags. He was trying to give me a hint of what a snake he was. But in my possum the snake story, the possum is the survivor.
On the evening of December 6, 1991, the city of Austin, Texas, was approaching the end of an ordinary Friday. At the beginning of the 1990s, Austin was already known as one of the state's fastest-growing communities, combining the atmosphere of a university town with expanding residential neighborhoods and local businesses. For many residents, it was a place where families gathered for dinner, teenagers met friends after school, and small businesses formed part of the rhythm of everyday life. Few could have anticipated that before the night was over, one crime would permanently alter the city's sense of security and become one of the longest-running and most discussed homicide investigations in Texas history. The event centered on a frozen yogurt shop called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt, located on West Anderson Lane. Like countless neighborhood businesses across the United States, it served local customers throughout the day and remained open into the evening. Nothing in the publicly documented record suggested that December 6th would be remembered differently from any other business day. Employees reported for work, customers came and went, and the store continued operating according to its usual schedule. Among the people present that evening were 4 girls whose names would later become inseparable from one of the most enduring unsolved cases in the state. Jennifer Harbison was 17 years old. Her younger sister, Sarah Harbison, was 15. Eliza Thomas, also 17, was working alongside Jennifer as an employee of the store. Amy Ayers, 13 years old, had come to meet friends. Jennifer and Eliza were carrying out their regular responsibilities as employees, while Sarah and Amy were visiting the shop. These basic facts, established during the investigation, remain the foundation of the historical record. Nothing in the available evidence indicates that the 4 girls expected anything unusual to occur during the evening. Their presence at the yogurt shop reflected ordinary routines rather than extraordinary circumstances. The location itself was familiar to local residents, and businesses of this kind were common gathering places for young people in the community. In later years, this contrast between an ordinary setting and an extraordinary crime would become one of the defining characteristics of the case. As the evening progressed, the business continued toward closing time. Outside the shop, traffic moved through the surrounding streets as it normally would on a Friday night. Austin's neighborhoods continued their routines without any indication that a major criminal investigation was about to begin. The city had experienced violent crime before, as every large community had, but nothing suggested that this particular location would soon become the center of national attention. Near midnight, events changed dramatically. A police officer on patrol observed smoke and flames coming from the yogurt shop. The discovery immediately transformed what first appeared to be a commercial fire into an emergency requiring both police officers and firefighters. Fire crews responded quickly in an effort to extinguish the blaze. Their immediate objective was to control the fire and prevent it from spreading to surrounding structures. Only after the flames had been brought under control could investigators begin determining what had occurred inside the building. The discovery made after the fire was extinguished fundamentally changed the nature of the incident. Inside the store, authorities found the bodies of the 4 girls. The investigation that followed established several key facts about the crime. All 4 victims had been shot. Investigators also concluded that the fire had been deliberately set after the killings in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence and complicate the investigation. The fire damaged the crime scene extensively, eliminating or degrading physical evidence that might otherwise have been available to detectives and forensic specialists. This conclusion became one of the most significant factors influencing every stage of the investigation that followed. The destruction caused by the fire created immediate challenges for law enforcement. Crime scene investigators rely heavily on physical evidence to reconstruct events, identify suspects, and establish timelines. In this case, however, the fire had altered the environment before investigators could document it completely. Evidence that might have identified those responsible had been destroyed or severely compromised. As a result, the investigation began under unusually difficult circumstances. News of the crime spread rapidly throughout Austin. The killing of 4 young girls in a neighborhood business was unlike any recent event many local residents could remember. The victims were teenagers whose lives had been connected to ordinary routines familiar to families across the city. 2 had been working at their jobs. 2 had simply been visiting the store. Their ages, the location of the crime, and the number of victims combined to produce widespread public shock. During the early 1990s, Austin was widely regarded as a comparatively safe city. Although no community is free from violent crime, many residents believe their neighborhoods offered a strong sense of security. The events of December 6th challenged that belief. A place associated with ordinary social activity had become the site of an exceptionally serious crime, and the apparent effort to destroy evidence through arson suggested planning beyond the killings themselves. As reports appeared across Texas, concern extended well beyond Austin. Families followed news coverage closely. Parents reconsidered routines that had previously seemed ordinary. Young people working evening shifts suddenly faced new questions about personal safety. Local businesses reviewed their security procedures, while residents waited for information that might explain how such a crime had occurred. The investigation quickly became one of the largest criminal inquiries in the city's history. Detectives began collecting information from every available source. Witnesses were interviewed. Potential leads were documented. Physical evidence recovered from the damaged scene underwent forensic examination using the technology available at the time. Every confirmed fact was carefully evaluated because the destruction caused by the fire limited the quantity of usable evidence. The passage of time would reveal just how difficult these initial circumstances had become. Thousands of investigative leads would eventually be examined. Hundreds of individuals would be interviewed during different stages of the inquiry. Advances in forensic science would repeatedly encourage investigators to return to preserved evidence, hoping that technologies unavailable in 1991 might reveal information that had once been impossible to obtain. Yet the fundamental obstacle remained unchanged. The crime scene had suffered extensive fire damage. Investigators faced the challenge of solving a multiple homicide despite the loss of significant physical evidence. This reality influenced every major decision that followed over the next 3 decades. For the families of Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers, the beginning of the investigation marked the start of an extraordinarily long search for answers. Public attention remained intense, but attention alone could not replace evidence. Detectives continued pursuing information, while the community struggled to understand how 4 young lives had been lost in circumstances that appeared both deliberate and carefully concealed. The case soon acquired a reputation extending beyond Austin itself. Law enforcement agencies, journalists, legal professionals, and members of the public increasingly referred to it as one of Texas's most challenging, unsolved homicide investigations. That reputation developed not only because of the number of victims, but also because investigators confronted an unusual combination of obstacles from the very beginning. The deliberate fire had significantly complicated the preservation of forensic evidence, while the absence of an immediately identifiable suspect meant that every credible lead required careful examination. As months turned into years, the investigation remained active. Detectives revisited evidence, reviewed witness statements, and evaluated new information whenever it became available. The case was never formally forgotten, even as other investigations demanded attention. Instead, it evolved into what would later be recognized as a long-term cold case, periodically renewed by developments in forensic science and investigative methods. Looking back from the perspective of more than 3 decades later, the events of December 6, 1991, stand as the beginning of a criminal investigation that would span generations of investigators. What began as an emergency response to a fire became a homicide investigation of extraordinary complexity. The deaths of Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers transformed an ordinary neighborhood business into one of the most significant crime scenes in Texas history. The questions raised that night would persist for decades, shaping public discussion about forensic science, criminal investigations, and the challenges of seeking justice when crucial evidence has been lost. Part 1 ends at the point where those questions had only just begun, with investigators facing a damaged crime scene, a shocked community, and a case whose full history had yet to unfold. By the time the fire at I Can't Believe It's Yogurt had been extinguished during the late hours of December 6, 1991, the emergency had already evolved into one of the most significant homicide investigations in the history of Austin, Texas. What initially appeared to be a commercial fire became a crime scene after authorities discovered the bodies of 4 teenage girls inside the building. The victims were identified as Jennifer Harbison, age 17, her younger sister Sarah Harbison, age 15, Eliza Thomas, age 17, and Amy Ayers, age 13. Jennifer and Eliza had been working at the yogurt shop that evening, while Sarah and Amy had come to visit. Their presence at the business reflected ordinary activities that suddenly became part of an extraordinary criminal investigation. The first responsibility facing investigators was to establish the basic facts surrounding the crime. Firefighters had already completed the urgent task of suppressing the blaze, allowing police officers and forensic personnel to begin examining the damaged interior. The condition of the building immediately presented substantial challenges. Investigators determined that the victims had been shot before the fire was deliberately set. This conclusion established that the blaze was not the cause of death, but rather an event that occurred after the killings. From the beginning, authorities believed that the fire had been intended to destroy evidence and complicate any future investigation. The impact of the fire on the crime scene was considerable. Modern homicide investigations depend heavily upon the careful preservation of physical evidence, including biological material, fingerprints, trace evidence, and other forensic indicators that can reconstruct the sequence of events or identify those responsible. In this case, however, the deliberate fire damaged large portions of the scene before investigators had an opportunity to document it in its original condition. Every area affected by the flames represented a potential loss of information. Although evidence could still be recovered, its quantity and quality had been significantly reduced. Despite these obstacles, investigators proceeded with a systematic examination of the available evidence. Every item capable of surviving the fire was collected, cataloged, and preserved. At the time, forensic science already played an important role in criminal investigations, but many of the technologies that would later become standard had not yet reached their current level of development. Consequently, investigators not only examined the available evidence using contemporary methods, but also preserved numerous items with the expectation that future scientific advances might permit additional testing. The homicide investigation expanded rapidly. Detectives from the Austin Police Department began interviewing individuals who might possess information relevant to the case. Witnesses who had been in or around the shopping center during the evening were identified and questioned. Employees, nearby businesses, and members of the public were asked to provide any information that might help establish a timeline or identify suspicious activity. Every confirmed detail became important because relatively little physical evidence remained after the fire. As information was collected, investigators worked to reconstruct the sequence of events leading to the discovery of the crime. They established that the yogurt shop had been operating normally during the evening. Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas had been working as employees, while Sarah Harbison and Amy Ayers had visited the store. At some point before the fire was discovered, all 4 girls were killed. Investigators further concluded that the building had then been intentionally set on fire. These facts formed the central framework of the investigation and remained unchanged throughout the decades that followed. Public attention intensified almost immediately. The murder of 4 teenage girls in a neighborhood business received extensive media coverage across Austin and throughout Texas. News organizations reported the confirmed facts available from law enforcement while emphasizing the unusual nature of the crime. The combination of multiple victims, a commercial location, and deliberate arson distinguished the investigation from many other homicide cases of the period. The reaction throughout Austin reflected the seriousness of the crime. During the early 1990s, many residents regarded the city as a relatively safe place to live and work. The events of December 6th challenged that perception. Parents reconsidered allowing their children to work evening shifts. Businesses reviewed their security procedures. Additional attention was given to locking doors, improving lighting, and installing security systems. These changes were not directed by evidence that another attack was imminent, but represented practical responses by individuals attempting to reduce risk following an event that had deeply affected the community. As the investigation continued, detectives evaluated every credible lead that emerged. Information supplied by witnesses, members of the public, and other law enforcement agencies required careful assessment. Large investigations frequently generate significant quantities of information, ranging from highly relevant evidence to reports that ultimately prove unrelated. Managing this volume of material became an important component of the Austin investigation. Each lead required documentation, review, and comparison with the known facts established at the crime scene. The complexity of the investigation increased because no immediate suspect could be conclusively identified. In many homicide cases, investigators are able to narrow their attention quickly through eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, or established relationships between victims and offenders. In this case, however, the available evidence did not immediately identify those responsible. The deliberate destruction of the crime scene meant that investigators needed to rely upon a combination of forensic examination, witness interviews, and continued public cooperation. The investigation soon became one of the largest undertaken by the Austin Police Department. Thousands of leads would eventually be reviewed during the years that followed. Hundreds of individuals were interviewed at various stages of the inquiry. Every significant development required comparison with the existing evidence to determine whether it supported or contradicted previously established facts. This process reflected the standard investigative principle that conclusions must be supported by verifiable evidence rather than speculation. Throughout the 1990s, forensic science continued to evolve. Techniques involving biological evidence, fingerprint analysis, and laboratory examination became increasingly sophisticated. Recognizing these advances, investigators repeatedly returned to evidence preserved from the original crime scene. Materials collected in 1991 were re-examined whenever new scientific methods offered the possibility of obtaining additional information. This practice reflected a broader trend in criminal investigations during the period, as many previously unsolved cases benefited from technological improvements unavailable at the time of the original investigation. The Austin case, however, remained exceptionally difficult. The destruction caused by the fire continued to limit the amount of recoverable evidence. While advances in forensic science improved the ability to analyze surviving material, technology could not restore evidence that had been permanently destroyed. Consequently, every surviving sample acquired increased importance. Proper preservation during the original investigation proved essential because future testing depended upon the continued availability of these materials. As months became years, the investigation remained active rather than closed. Detectives continued evaluating information as it became available, preserving evidence, reviewing witness statements, and comparing new leads against the existing record. This long-term approach reflected the understanding that serious criminal investigations may require extended periods before sufficient evidence emerges to identify those responsible. Rather than ending when immediate progress proved difficult, the investigation adapted to changing circumstances and technological developments. The case gradually acquired the designation of a cold case, a term commonly used to describe investigations that remain unresolved despite substantial investigative efforts. Becoming a cold case did not signify that the investigation had ended. Instead, it indicated that no immediate investigative steps had produced sufficient evidence to resolve the crimes. Responsibility for preserving evidence, maintaining investigative records, and evaluating future developments continued throughout the following decades. For the families of Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers, the continuation of the investigation represented an ongoing search for answers. Public attention periodically returned to the case as anniversaries approached or new investigative developments occurred. Each renewed examination reflected the continuing commitment of law enforcement to determine who was responsible for the deaths of the 4 girls. By the end of the investigation's initial phase, several conclusions had been firmly established. 4 teenage victims had been killed inside the yogurt shop. Each had died from gunshot wounds. The building had then been deliberately set on fire, significantly damaging the crime scene and destroying valuable evidence. Despite extensive investigative efforts, no suspect had yet been conclusively identified. Nevertheless, evidence had been preserved, thousands of leads had been documented, and investigators remained committed to continuing the inquiry as forensic science advanced. These early years defined the character of the Austin yogurt shop investigation. Rather than producing immediate answers, they established a careful foundation based upon verified facts, preserved evidence, and systematic investigation. The absence of a quick resolution did not diminish the significance of the work completed during this period. On the contrary, the decisions made by investigators in preserving evidence and documenting every available lead would later prove essential when new scientific methods became available. The investigation had entered a prolonged period of uncertainty, but its historical significance was already becoming clear. What began as an emergency response on a December night in 1991 had evolved into one of the most enduring criminal investigations in Texas history, with questions that would remain unresolved for decades before advances in forensic science offered the possibility of new answers. As the investigation into the Austin yogurt shop murders continued through the 1990s, law enforcement authorities remained committed to identifying those responsible for the deaths of Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers. The passage of time did not reduce the significance of the case. Instead, it reinforced its status as one of the most challenging homicide investigations in Texas. Detectives continued reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and examining new information whenever credible leads emerged. Despite these efforts, no combination of evidence had yet produced a conclusive resolution. By the latter part of the decade, investigators focused increasing attention on a group of local men who became subjects of the investigation. In 1999, for individuals, Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn, were identified as suspects during the course of the inquiry. Their identification represented an important development because, after years without publicly identified suspects, the investigation appeared to be moving toward possible criminal prosecutions. As investigators questioned the suspects, two of them gave confessions during lengthy interviews with law enforcement. At the time, these statements appeared to represent a significant breakthrough. Confessions are often considered important forms of evidence in criminal investigations because they may provide details that can be compared with independently established facts. Investigators therefore evaluated the statements alongside the physical evidence that had been preserved since 1991. However, the confessions soon became the subject of substantial legal and evidentiary scrutiny. Defense attorneys challenged the reliability of the statements, arguing that questions existed regarding whether the confessions had been given voluntarily. These concerns became an important part of the legal proceedings that followed. Rather than ending the investigation, the confessions introduced new questions concerning the relationship between interview procedures and the reliability of admissions made during criminal investigations. At the same time, forensic science continued advancing. During the years following the murders, laboratories developed increasingly sophisticated methods for analyzing biological evidence. DNA technology, in particular, became one of the most significant developments in modern criminal investigations. Cases that had previously depended primarily upon witness testimony or circumstantial evidence could increasingly be evaluated through scientific examination of biological material recovered from crime scenes. The Austin yogurt shop investigation benefited from these technological advances because investigators had preserved evidence collected during the original examination of the burned building. Although the fire had destroyed much of the available forensic material, some evidence remained suitable for scientific testing. As improved laboratory methods became available, these preserved materials were re-examined using techniques that had not existed or had not yet matured in 1991. The results of those examinations proved highly significant. DNA analysis failed to match the biological evidence recovered from the crime scene with the individuals who had been accused. Rather than supporting the developing prosecutions, the scientific evidence contradicted them. The mismatch between the preserved DNA evidence and the suspects fundamentally altered the direction of the investigation. The consequences extended beyond forensic laboratories into the courtroom. Criminal prosecutions require evidence capable of establishing guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. While confessions can constitute important evidence, they must be evaluated together with all other available facts. In the Austin case, the DNA findings raised serious questions because the scientific evidence did not correspond with the individuals who had been accused. As these developments became known, the legal cases against the suspects began to change. Convictions that had been obtained were overturned, while other charges were dismissed or otherwise failed to proceed. The investigation therefore returned to the same central question that had existed since December 1991: who had committed the murders? The outcome demonstrated the growing importance of forensic science within the criminal justice system. During earlier decades, many investigations depended heavily upon witness testimony, interviews, and confessions. By the beginning of the 21st century, DNA evidence had become one of the most influential forms of scientific evidence available to investigators and courts. In the Austin case, laboratory findings prevented the investigation from reaching a conclusion unsupported by the available forensic record. The case also illustrated the complexity of evaluating confessions within criminal investigations. The existence of a confession does not eliminate the need for corroborating evidence. Courts, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and investigators all consider whether statements are supported by independently verified facts. When scientific evidence conflicts with admissions made during questioning, those conflicts require careful examination before legal responsibility can be established. As the prosecutions collapsed, the investigation entered another extended period without a confirmed suspect. Detectives continued preserving evidence and reviewing investigative records while remaining attentive to future technological developments. The inability to secure sustainable convictions did not reduce the seriousness of the crimes or diminish the importance of identifying those responsible. Instead, it emphasized the necessity of relying upon evidence capable of withstanding continued legal and scientific examination. Throughout this period, the investigation remained active despite the absence of immediate progress. Thousands of leads accumulated over the years continued to form part of the investigative record. Witness interviews, forensic reports, laboratory analyses, and documentary evidence were preserved because future investigators might identify connections that had not previously been recognized. This long-term approach reflected a broader principle common to major unsolved investigations. Preserving information can become as important as discovering new evidence. The Austin Police Department continued treating the case as an unresolved homicide investigation. Every significant advancement in forensic science created another opportunity to re-examine preserved materials. Investigators recognized that evidence collected decades earlier might produce new information when analyzed using improved laboratory methods. Such reassessments had become increasingly common in cold case investigations across the United States, particularly as DNA technology expanded its capabilities. The Austin yogurt shop murders therefore remained both a historical investigation and an evolving scientific inquiry. The original crime scene had been examined using the best methods available in 1991, yet scientific progress repeatedly created opportunities to revisit preserved evidence. Rather than replacing earlier investigative work, these advances built upon the careful documentation completed during the original investigation. Public interest in the case also continued throughout these years. Media organizations periodically revisited the investigation, particularly on significant anniversaries. Reports generally emphasized the same verified facts. 4 teenage girls had been murdered inside a neighborhood yogurt shop. The building had then been deliberately set on fire. Extensive investigative efforts had identified suspects whose alleged involvement ultimately proved unsupported by DNA evidence, and the identity of the perpetrator remained unresolved. The case increasingly came to represent broader questions concerning criminal investigations. It demonstrated the value of preserving physical evidence, even when available technology cannot immediately provide answers. It also illustrated how scientific advances may require investigators and courts to reconsider earlier conclusions. Most importantly, it reinforced the principle that criminal convictions must be supported by reliable evidence capable of independent verification. For the families of the victims, the collapse of the prosecutions meant that the search for accountability remained unfinished. Although significant investigative efforts had been undertaken, the legal system had not produced a final determination regarding responsibility for the murders. The investigation therefore continued, sustained by preserved evidence and the possibility that future scientific developments might provide answers unavailable during previous decades. By the early 21st century, the Austin yogurt shop murders had become widely recognized as one of Texas's most prominent cold cases. Its reputation rested not only upon the severity of the crime but also upon the extraordinary duration of the investigation. Each unsuccessful attempt to resolve the case underscored the importance of continuing the search rather than accepting uncertainty as a permanent conclusion. The developments of this period ultimately reshaped the investigation in two important ways. First, DNA analysis demonstrated that the available biological evidence did not support the prosecutions that had emerged during the late 1990s. Second, the preservation of evidence ensured that the investigation remained capable of benefiting from future scientific innovation. These outcomes prevented the case from ending with conclusions unsupported by forensic evidence and preserved the possibility that later technological advances might identify a different investigative direction. Although the investigation had not yet reached a resolution, its course had changed fundamentally. The focus shifted away from previously accused individuals and returned to the preserved evidence itself. Investigators increasingly understood that any future breakthrough would likely depend upon advances in forensic science rather than previously examined witness testimony or disputed confessions. This transition established the foundation for the next major chapter in the history of the case, one in which technological developments decades after the crimes would reopen investigative possibilities that had remained beyond reach since the night of December 6, 1991. For more than 3 decades after the murders at the Austin yogurt shop, the investigation remained one of the most significant unresolved homicide cases in Texas. Although earlier prosecutions had failed and the individuals previously accused were no longer considered responsible based on DNA evidence, the case itself did not come to an end. Instead, it entered a prolonged period in which investigators continued preserving evidence, reviewing historical records, and monitoring advances in forensic science that might eventually provide new investigative opportunities. This long-term approach reflected an important principle in modern criminal investigations. Evidence collected during the original examination of a crime scene may acquire new value as laboratory methods improve. While some physical evidence had been permanently lost because of the fire deliberately set inside the yogurt shop, investigators had preserved the material that survived. Those preserved items became increasingly important as forensic science developed during the decades following the murders. Throughout the years, advances in DNA analysis transformed criminal investigations around the world. New laboratory techniques made it possible to examine biological evidence with greater precision than had been possible during the early 1990s. Samples that once produced limited or inconclusive results could sometimes yield new information when tested using updated scientific methods. These technological improvements encouraged law enforcement agencies across the United States to revisit unsolved cases in which preserved evidence remained available for examination. The Austin yogurt shop investigation followed this broader trend. Detectives and forensic specialists repeatedly reviewed the evidence collected in 1991, recognizing that scientific progress might eventually overcome some of the limitations that had existed during the original investigation. The effort required patience and careful preservation of historical records. Every laboratory report, investigative document, and physical exhibit formed part of a case file that had remained active across multiple generations of investigators. The investigation, therefore, became an example of continuity within law enforcement. Personnel changed over the years as detectives retired and new investigators assumed responsibility for unresolved cases. Despite these transitions, the evidence remained preserved, and the investigative record continued to guide future examination. This continuity ensured that new forensic techniques could be applied to evidence collected decades earlier without requiring investigators to reconstruct information that had already been documented. By 2025, developments in forensic DNA technology provided investigators with an opportunity to conduct another detailed examination of preserved biological evidence from the crime scene. These methods represented a significant advancement compared with the scientific capabilities available in 1991. Rather than relying solely on the analytical tools of the original investigation, specialists could now evaluate surviving evidence using techniques developed over many years of scientific research and practical application. The renewed forensic examination produced the most significant investigative development since the murders themselves. After applying modern DNA analysis together with existing ballistic evidence and assessments of the characteristics of the offense, investigators identified Robert Eugene Brashers as the individual most likely responsible for the murders. According to authorities, this conclusion resulted from combining newly developed forensic capabilities with evidence that had been preserved throughout the investigation. The identification did not depend upon a single piece of information, but rather upon the cumulative evaluation of multiple forms of evidence examined under contemporary scientific standards. Robert Eugene Brashers had already died in 1999. As a result, the investigation reached this important conclusion after the suspected individual was no longer alive. Although this circumstance prevented any future criminal prosecution, investigators regarded the forensic findings as a major breakthrough in a case that had remained unresolved for more than 30 years. In September 2025, the Austin Police Department publicly announced the development. The announcement represented one of the most significant moments in the history of the investigation. For decades, the case had been defined primarily by uncertainty, disputed confessions, unsuccessful prosecutions, and unanswered questions. The new forensic findings offered investigators a substantially different direction based upon scientific analysis unavailable during earlier stages of the inquiry. At the same time, law enforcement emphasized that the investigation remained active. Although Robert Eugene Brashers had been identified as the most likely suspect through the available forensic evidence, authorities continued reviewing the case in order to clarify every aspect that could still be established from the surviving record. This position reflected standard investigative practice in major homicide cases, particularly those involving multiple victims and extended historical investigations. The announcement also highlighted the importance of evidence preservation. Had investigators failed to retain biological material recovered from the original crime scene, later forensic analysis would not have been possible. The careful documentation and storage of evidence during the initial investigation allowed scientists decades later to apply methods that did not exist when the murders occurred. In this respect, the case demonstrated how decisions made during the earliest stages of an investigation may influence its outcome many years afterward. The developments of 2025 also renewed public attention to the Austin yogurt shop murders. The case had remained familiar to many residents of Austin because of its historical significance, but the identification of a new suspect brought national interest once again. News organizations reported the investigative breakthrough while also explaining the scientific advances that had contributed to the new findings. Public discussion focused not only on the individual identified by investigators, but also on the role of modern forensic science in addressing unresolved criminal investigations. The case became an illustration of how cold case investigations have evolved during the 21st century. Earlier generations of detectives relied primarily upon witness testimony, physical evidence observable through available laboratory methods, and conventional investigative techniques. While these approaches remained essential, advances in DNA technology significantly expanded the ability of investigators to evaluate evidence collected years or even decades earlier. The Austin investigation reflected this transformation by demonstrating how preserved biological evidence could continue providing investigative value long after the original crime. Equally significant was the relationship between the new forensic findings and the earlier prosecutions. The same scientific discipline that had previously excluded the individuals charged during the late 1990s now contributed to identifying a different investigative direction. This progression illustrated an important characteristic of forensic science. Its purpose is not to confirm prior assumptions, but to evaluate evidence objectively. In the Austin case, DNA analysis first demonstrated that the biological evidence did not support earlier prosecutions and later contributed to identifying another individual as the most likely suspect. The renewed investigation, therefore, reinforced confidence in scientific methods that rely upon measurable evidence rather than speculation. Investigators publicly described the development as a major breakthrough because it emerged from the careful re-examination of preserved material using contemporary forensic techniques. Although many questions concerning the precise circumstances of the crime could never be answered because of the destruction caused by the fire, the available evidence nevertheless provided substantially more information than had previously been possible. The events of 2025 also demonstrated the importance of maintaining unresolved investigations even after many years have passed. Cases designated as cold cases are not necessarily inactive. Instead, they remain capable of benefiting from new technology, additional evidence, or improved analytical methods. The Austin investigation represented a particularly clear example of this principle because its most significant forensic development occurred more than 3 decades after the murders themselves. For the broader criminal justice system, the investigation illustrated both the possibilities and the limitations of modern forensic science. Advances in DNA analysis can identify new investigative directions, clarify previously disputed evidence, and strengthen confidence in factual conclusions supported by laboratory testing. At the same time, no scientific method can restore evidence permanently destroyed at a crime scene or recreate every detail of historical events. The deliberate fire set inside the yogurt shop continued to limit what investigators could ultimately determine, even after substantial technological progress. Nevertheless, the developments announced in 2025 marked the most substantial advance in the investigation since December 1991. The identification of Robert Eugene Brasher's as the most likely suspect fundamentally changed the historical understanding of the case. Although the criminal justice system could no longer conduct a prosecution because the suspect had died decades earlier, investigators were able to provide a new evidence-based assessment supported by modern forensic analysis. By the conclusion of this phase of the investigation, the Austin yogurt shop murders had evolved from a case defined primarily by unanswered questions into one characterized by significant scientific progress. The investigation had not erased the loss experienced by the victims' families or eliminated every uncertainty surrounding the crime, but it had demonstrated the enduring value of preserving evidence and continuing investigative efforts across generations. More than 30 years after 4 young lives were taken inside a neighborhood business, advances in forensic science had provided the strongest investigative direction the case had ever produced, establishing the foundation for the final legal and historical developments that followed. The announcement made by the Austin Police Department in September 2025 represented a turning point in the history of the Austin yogurt shop murders. After more than 3 decades of investigation, advances in forensic DNA analysis, considered together with ballistic evidence and the documented characteristics of the crime, led investigators to identify Robert Eugene Brasher's as the individual most likely responsible for the murders of Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers. Although the investigation continued in order to clarify every aspect that remained capable of verification, the announcement fundamentally changed the direction of a case that had long been defined by uncertainty. Because Robert Eugene Brasher's had died in 1999, the investigation could not proceed toward a criminal trial. Under ordinary circumstances, investigators who identify a living suspect may present evidence to prosecutors, who then determine whether criminal charges should be filed. If charges are approved, the case moves through the judicial system, allowing evidence to be examined in court and legal responsibility to be determined through established procedures. In this case, however, the suspect identified through modern forensic analysis had been deceased for many years. As a result, no prosecution could take place, and no criminal trial would be held. This circumstance meant that the investigation reached an unusual conclusion. Rather than ending with courtroom proceedings, testimony, or a judicial verdict concerning the newly identified suspect, the case concluded through the public presentation of investigative findings supported by forensic evidence. While this outcome differed from the traditional path of a homicide prosecution, it nevertheless represented the most substantial resolution achieved since the murders occurred in December 1991. At the same time, the legal consequences extended beyond the identification of a new suspect. The renewed forensic findings also required authorities to address the status of the 4 men who had previously been accused during the late 1990s. Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn had all been investigated during earlier stages of the case, and legal proceedings involving some of them had become a significant part of the investigation's history. Over time, DNA evidence demonstrated that the biological material recovered from the crime scene did not match the individuals who had been prosecuted. Convictions and charges associated with those earlier proceedings had already been overturned or dismissed as the scientific evidence became available. The investigative developments announced in 2025 strengthened the conclusion that those earlier prosecutions had not identified the correct perpetrator. As a result, legal authorities in Texas continue the process of formally resolving the remaining consequences associated with those accusations. This effort reflected the broader responsibility of the criminal justice system not only to identify those responsible for crimes, but also to correct earlier legal outcomes when new evidence demonstrates that previous conclusions cannot be supported. In February 2026, a Texas court formally dismissed the remaining accusations against the 4 men who had previously been charged in connection with the Austin yogurt shop murders. This legal action completed a process that had developed over many years through continued forensic examination and judicial review. By removing the remaining legal accusations, the court recognized that the available evidence no longer supported continuing those cases. The court's decision represented an important legal milestone. Criminal investigations seek both accountability for offenders and fairness within the judicial process. These objectives depend upon reliable evidence capable of supporting legal conclusions. In the Austin investigation, the evolution of DNA technology demonstrated that scientific evidence must remain central to the evaluation of criminal responsibility. As additional laboratory analysis became available, legal authorities adjusted their conclusions accordingly. The resolution reached in 2026 therefore reflected 2 separate but closely connected developments. First, investigators had identified Robert Eugene Brashers as the individual most likely responsible through modern forensic analysis. Second, the legal system completed the process of clearing the 4 previously accused individuals whose alleged involvement had not been supported by the preserved DNA evidence. Together, these developments marked the most significant legal progress achieved since the original investigation began. Although the investigation did not culminate in a criminal trial against the newly identified suspect, the findings nevertheless provided investigators and prosecutors with an evidence-based explanation that had remained unavailable for more than 30 years. The inability to prosecute resulted solely from the fact that the suspect had died long before the forensic evidence reached its modern level of reliability. Consequently, the investigation demonstrated both the strengths and the limitations of historical criminal inquiries. Scientific advances can reveal new conclusions decades later, but they cannot reverse the passage of time or recreate legal opportunities that no longer exist. For the families of Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers, the developments of 2025 and 2026 marked the first time that investigators could publicly present a scientifically supported investigative conclusion after more than 3 decades of uncertainty. While no legal proceeding could alter the events of December 1991, the investigation had progressed further than at any previous point in its history. Beyond its immediate legal consequences, the Austin yogurt shop investigation became a significant case study in the evolution of forensic science within the American criminal justice system. The investigation illustrated how preserved evidence may remain valuable across decades, allowing future scientific methods to examine questions that earlier technologies could not answer. This principle has influenced the handling of numerous cold cases, emphasizing the importance of evidence preservation regardless of the investigative limitations existing at the time of collection. The case also demonstrated the relationship between forensic science and judicial review. DNA evidence first played a decisive role by contradicting the earlier prosecutions, preventing unsupported convictions from remaining in effect. Years later, continued scientific advancement contributed to identifying a different investigative conclusion. These developments illustrated that forensic science serves not only to identify suspects, but also to evaluate the accuracy of previous investigative and legal decisions. Equally important was the role of institutional continuity. The investigation extended across more than 3 decades, involving multiple generations of detectives, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and laboratory personnel. Throughout this period, evidence remained preserved, investigative records were maintained, and each successive stage of the inquiry built upon the work completed by earlier investigators. Without this continuity, the scientific developments of 2025 would have had far less practical value. The Austin yogurt shop murders therefore occupy a distinctive place within the history of criminal investigations in Texas. The case combined several characteristics that together made it exceptional: the murder of 4 young victims in a single incident, the deliberate destruction of the crime scene through fire, decades of investigative effort, disputed confessions, unsuccessful prosecutions, advances in forensic DNA analysis, and finally an evidence-based investigative breakthrough achieved more than 30 years after the crimes occurred. By the conclusion of the legal developments in 2026, the historical narrative of the investigation had changed substantially. The case was no longer defined solely by the absence of answers. Instead, it became an example of how scientific progress can reshape the understanding of unresolved crimes while simultaneously correcting earlier investigative conclusions that proved inconsistent with later forensic evidence. Even so, the investigation also illustrated an enduring reality of historical homicide cases. Some questions remain permanently beyond the reach of investigators because evidence has been destroyed or because key individuals are no longer available to provide testimony. The deliberate fire set inside the yogurt shop in December 1991 permanently limited the amount of information capable of being recovered. Although modern science significantly advanced the investigation, it could not fully overcome every consequence of that original destruction. Nevertheless, the legal and investigative developments completed between 2025 and 2026 represented the closest approximation to resolution that the case had achieved since the murders occurred. Through careful preservation of evidence, repeated forensic examination, and continued judicial review, authorities were able to provide conclusions supported by the strongest scientific evidence available. The investigation demonstrated that the pursuit of factual accuracy may continue across decades and that developments in forensic science can alter the historical understanding of crimes long after they were committed. As the legal process reached its conclusion, the Austin yogurt shop murders assumed a lasting place in the history of American criminal investigation. The case became recognized not only because of the tragedy that occurred in 1991, but also because it illustrated the continuing evolution of forensic science, the importance of preserving evidence, and the responsibility of the justice system to revise earlier conclusions when new, reliable evidence emerges. The events of 2025 and 2026 therefore marked not simply the closing chapter of a single investigation, but also an important milestone in the broader history of cold case investigations and the application of modern forensic technology to crimes that had remained unresolved for generations. More than 3 decades separate the events of December 6, 1991, from the major investigative developments announced in 2025 and the legal actions completed in 2026. During that period, the Austin yogurt shop murders evolved from an active homicide investigation into one of the best-known cold cases in Texas before eventually reaching its most substantial evidence-based resolution. The history of the case demonstrates how the passage of time can shape both criminal investigations and public understanding of major crimes, while also illustrating the continuing importance of scientific progress within the justice system. The murders of Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers immediately became a defining event in the history of Austin. The 4 victims were young teenagers whose presence at the yogurt shop reflected ordinary activities on a Friday evening. Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas were working their scheduled shifts, while Sarah Harbison and Amy Ayers had come to the store to visit. The investigation established that all 4 were shot inside the business before the building was deliberately set on fire. Those verified facts remained constant throughout every stage of the investigation and formed the foundation upon which every later forensic and legal development was built. The deliberate fire had consequences that extended far beyond the night of the crime. By damaging the scene and destroying evidence, it created investigative challenges that persisted for decades. Detectives were required to conduct one of the largest homicide investigations in the city's history despite significant limitations in the available forensic material. The destruction of evidence did not prevent the investigation from continuing, but it substantially increased the difficulty of identifying those responsible through conventional investigative methods. As the years passed, the Austin yogurt shop murders became widely recognized as a classic cold case. This designation reflected not a lack of investigative effort, but rather the absence of sufficient evidence to reach a definitive conclusion despite extensive police work. Thousands of leads were examined, hundreds of interviews were conducted, and preserved evidence was repeatedly reviewed as forensic science advanced. The continued attention given to the case demonstrated that unresolved investigations may remain active for many years when investigators believe future developments could provide new opportunities for scientific examination. One of the most significant historical lessons arising from the investigation concerns the preservation of evidence. The original investigators collected and retained physical material recovered from the crime scene despite the severe damage caused by the fire. Although the forensic technology available in 1991 could not answer every question, the preservation of that evidence ensured that future generations of investigators would be able to apply more advanced scientific techniques. The breakthrough announced in 2025 depended upon decisions made decades earlier to maintain evidence and investigative records according to professional standards. The evolution of DNA analysis also occupies a central place in the history of the case. During the early stages of the investigation, forensic science possessed capabilities that were considerably more limited than those available 3 decades later. As laboratory methods improved, preserved evidence could be re-examined using increasingly sophisticated techniques. The Austin investigation demonstrated how scientific progress may transform the evidentiary value of material collected long before those technologies existed. The case further illustrated the role of forensic science in evaluating earlier investigative conclusions. DNA evidence did not merely contribute to identifying a new investigative direction. It also demonstrated that the biological evidence recovered from the crime scene did not support the prosecutions brought against the individuals accused during the late 1990s. Those findings ultimately resulted in convictions being overturned, charges being dismissed, and, following the developments announced in 2025, the formal removal of the remaining accusations in 2026. In this respect, forensic science served both investigative and corrective functions within the criminal justice system. The identification of Robert Eugene Brasher's as the most likely suspect represented the most significant investigative development in the case. According to the Austin Police Department, this conclusion resulted from the application of modern DNA analysis together with ballistic evidence and the documented characteristics of the offense. Because Brasher's had died in 1999, no criminal prosecution could follow. Nevertheless, the announcement marked the first time investigators were able to present a scientifically supported explanation for the case after more than 30 years of uncertainty. The inability to conduct a trial also illustrates an important limitation shared by many historical criminal investigations. Scientific advances can identify suspects and clarify evidence long after crimes have occurred, but they cannot reverse the passage of time. When a suspect has died before the completion of an investigation, the criminal justice system is unable to test the evidence through the ordinary judicial process. The Austin investigation therefore reached its conclusion through forensic findings and official investigative announcements rather than through courtroom proceedings or a criminal verdict. Beyond its direct legal consequences, the investigation has become an important example in the broader history of cold case investigations in the United States. Law enforcement agencies frequently cite the value of preserving evidence because future scientific developments may provide answers unavailable during the original investigation. The Austin yogurt shop case demonstrates this principle with unusual clarity. The evidence collected in 1991 continued to produce meaningful information more than 3 decades later, emphasizing the long-term significance of careful forensic preservation. The investigation also reflects the importance of institutional continuity. Over the course of more than 30 years, responsibility for the case passed through multiple generations of detectives, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and laboratory personnel. Each group inherited investigative records, preserved evidence, and documented conclusions from those who had worked on the case before them. This continuity allowed scientific advances to be incorporated into the investigation without requiring investigators to reconstruct decades of previous work. The historical record remained intact because evidence and documentation had been maintained throughout the life of the investigation. The impact of the case extended beyond law enforcement agencies. Within Austin, the murders influenced public awareness of crime prevention and commercial security. The deaths of 4 young victims inside a neighborhood business prompted many families and business owners to reconsider safety measures. Although these responses developed from the circumstances of a single case, they reflected broader concerns about protecting employees, particularly young workers, during evening business hours. The investigation, therefore, became part of the city's social history as well as its legal history. The Austin yogurt shop murders also contributed to public understanding of the relationship between forensic science and the criminal justice system. The case demonstrated that scientific evidence must remain central to the evaluation of criminal responsibility. Investigative conclusions are strengthened when supported by reliable forensic analysis and must be reconsidered when new scientific findings contradict earlier assumptions. This principle has become increasingly important as advances in DNA technology continue to influence criminal investigations worldwide. From a historical perspective, the case stands as a reminder that the search for factual accuracy may continue long after a crime has occurred. The investigation remained active across changing technologies, evolving forensic methods, and multiple generations of investigators. Rather than accepting uncertainty as a permanent outcome, law enforcement continued reviewing evidence whenever scientific progress created new opportunities for examination. The eventual breakthrough demonstrated that unresolved investigations may still produce significant developments even after many years. At the same time, the case illustrates that some consequences of violent crime cannot be altered by investigative success. Scientific advances may identify likely offenders, clarify historical events, and correct earlier legal conclusions, but they cannot reverse the loss experienced by victims or restore opportunities that disappeared with the passage of time. The destruction of evidence caused by the fire and the death of the suspect before the forensic breakthrough ensured that certain questions would remain beyond the reach of both investigators and the courts. Today, the Austin yogurt shop murders remain one of the most significant criminal cases in Texas history. Their importance derives not only from the events of December 1991, but also from the investigation that followed. The case encompasses nearly every major challenge associated with long-term homicide investigations: a severely damaged crime scene, decades of investigative effort, disputed confessions, evolving forensic science, the preservation of evidence across generations, and a modern DNA breakthrough that reshaped the historical understanding of the crime. The investigation ultimately became a landmark example of how science, careful evidence preservation, and continued institutional commitment can transform the understanding of a case long after its original investigation has ended. Although no criminal trial concluded the case, the findings announced in 2025 and the legal actions completed in 2026 provided the strongest evidence-based resolution achieved in more than 30 years. The Austin yogurt shop murders therefore occupy a lasting place in the history of criminal investigation, illustrating both the possibilities and the limitations of modern forensic science, while emphasizing the enduring importance of accuracy, evidence, and persistence in the pursuit of justice. The history of the Austin yogurt shop murders extends beyond the events of December 6, 1991, and beyond the investigative milestones announced more than 3 decades later. While the murders themselves remain the central focus of the case, the investigation has also become an important historical example of how criminal justice systems respond to complex, long-term homicide investigations. The case is frequently discussed not because it produced a conventional courtroom conclusion, but because it illustrates the challenges of investigating violent crime when crucial evidence has been deliberately destroyed and when scientific capabilities continue to evolve over time. When the investigation began in 1991, Forensic science was already an established component of criminal investigations, but many of the analytical methods that later transformed cold case investigations either did not yet exist or had not reached the level of precision available decades later. Investigators therefore worked within the scientific limitations of their time while preserving as much evidence as possible for future examination. This decision proved to be one of the most significant aspects of the investigation's long-term success. The Austin Police Department's continued commitment to maintaining the case demonstrates an important characteristic of major cold case investigations. A case may remain unresolved for many years without being abandoned. Evidence can continue to be reviewed, investigative files can remain active, and new forensic techniques can be applied whenever scientific advances create additional opportunities. The Austin investigation followed this pattern for more than 30 years, showing that the passage of time does not necessarily end an investigation. The preservation of physical evidence became one of the defining features of a case. Although the deliberate fire inside the yogurt shop destroyed a substantial amount of potential forensic material, investigators carefully retained the evidence that survived. Every preserved sample, document, and laboratory report became part of a historical record capable of supporting future scientific examination. This careful preservation allowed investigators in later years to revisit evidence using technologies unavailable during the original investigation. The investigation also reflects the increasing importance of DNA analysis in modern criminal justice. During the decades following the murders, forensic DNA testing became one of the most influential investigative tools available to law enforcement agencies. Across the United States, many previously unsolved cases were re-examined as laboratory techniques improved. The Austin yogurt shop investigation became part of this broader national trend, demonstrating how preserved biological evidence could remain valuable decades after it was first collected. Equally significant was the role that forensic science played in evaluating earlier investigative conclusions. The same scientific discipline that ultimately contributed to identifying Robert Eugene Brasher's as the most likely suspect had previously demonstrated that DNA recovered from the crime scene did not match the individuals who had been prosecuted during the late 1990s. This sequence of events illustrates an essential principle of forensic investigation. Scientific evidence is intended to test investigative theories objectively rather than confirm assumptions. In the Austin case, advances in DNA analysis both corrected earlier legal outcomes and provided a new investigative direction. The legal developments completed in 2026 further reinforce this principle. The formal dismissal of the remaining accusations against the 4 previously accused men reflected the justice system's responsibility to respond to reliable scientific evidence. As new forensic findings became available, legal conclusions were revised accordingly. This process demonstrated that criminal investigations and judicial proceedings may evolve when objective evidence changes the factual understanding of a case. From a historical perspective, the Austin yogurt shop murders have become an important case study in evidence preservation, forensic science, and long-term investigative practice. Law enforcement agencies frequently emphasize that evidence should be collected and preserved carefully even when immediate analysis cannot provide definitive answers. The Austin investigation illustrates why this principle remains essential. Decisions made during the first days of the investigation directly influenced what investigators were able to accomplish more than 30 years later. The case also demonstrates the importance of institutional continuity. Responsibility for the investigation passed through multiple generations of detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and laboratory personnel. Despite changes in personnel, the investigative record remained intact. Preserved evidence, documented interviews, forensic reports, and historical records allowed successive investigators to continue the work without losing the foundation established in 1991. This continuity became an essential factor in the eventual forensic breakthrough. Another lasting aspect of the case is its influence on public understanding of cold case investigations. Many unresolved crimes receive renewed attention only after significant scientific or investigative developments occur. The Austin yogurt shop murders illustrate that a cold case is not necessarily inactive. Instead, it remains open to future advances in science, technology, and investigative methodology. The investigation therefore serves as an example of how persistence and evidence preservation may eventually produce meaningful progress, even after decades without resolution. The case also highlights the limitations that investigators may face despite substantial scientific advances. The deliberate fire that followed the murders permanently damaged the crime scene and destroyed evidence that could never be recovered. Modern forensic science significantly improved investigators' ability to analyze the material that survived, but no technological development could restore evidence that had already been lost. This reality remains an important reminder that the quality of available evidence often determines the limits of what can ultimately be established. Today, the Austin yogurt shop murders occupy a distinctive place in the history of criminal investigation in Texas. The case is remembered not only because 4 young lives were lost, but also because the investigation became one of the state's most significant examples of the challenges associated with long-term homicide inquiries. It brought together many elements that continue to shape modern criminal investigations: extensive evidence collection, repeated forensic review, disputed confessions, evolving DNA technology, and the continuing obligation to reassess earlier conclusions when new scientific evidence emerges. The historical legacy of the case therefore extends beyond a single criminal investigation. It demonstrates the value of preserving evidence, the importance of scientific objectivity, and the necessity of maintaining unresolved investigations when credible opportunities for future progress remain. It also illustrates that justice systems must be prepared both to identify responsible individuals through reliable evidence and to correct earlier conclusions when subsequent scientific developments require reconsideration. Although the events of December 6, 1991, can never be changed, the investigation that followed continues to provide important lessons for law enforcement, forensic science, and the administration of justice. More than 3 decades after the murders, the Austin yogurt shop case stands as a historical record of persistence, evolving scientific capability, and the enduring pursuit of factual accuracy. Its legacy rests not only in the tragedy that occurred, but also in the careful preservation of evidence and the commitment to continue seeking answers through verified facts and objective investigation. The Austin yogurt shop murders remain one of the most widely recognized criminal investigations in Texas history, not only because of the seriousness of the crime, but also because of the extraordinary length and complexity of the search for answers. The case began as a local tragedy in December 1991 and developed into a decades-long investigation that reflected many of the challenges faced by modern law enforcement when confronting crimes involving limited evidence, disputed conclusions, and rapidly changing forensic technology. The events at the yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane became a significant part of Austin's history. 4 teenage girls, Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers, were killed inside the business. Investigators determined that the victims had been shot and that the building was intentionally set on fire afterward. These facts established the foundation of the investigation and remained central throughout every subsequent review of the case. The circumstances surrounding the crime created immediate difficulties for investigators. The fire damaged the location and destroyed much of the available physical evidence. In homicide investigations, the earliest examination of a crime scene is often critical because physical evidence can provide information about what happened and who may have been responsible. In this case, the deliberate destruction of the scene meant that investigators had to work with a significantly reduced amount of usable evidence. Despite these limitations, investigators conducted an extensive examination and collected the material that survived. The evidence was preserved, analyzed, and incorporated into the investigative record. Although the available technology of the early 1990s could not provide a final resolution, the decision to retain these materials became essential decades later when forensic science developed new methods of analysis. The investigation's long history reflects the changing nature of criminal investigations in the United States. During the years following the murders, law enforcement agencies increasingly incorporated advanced forensic techniques into their work. DNA analysis became one of the most important developments in criminal investigations, allowing scientists to examine biological evidence with levels of accuracy that were not available during earlier decades. The Austin case became an example of how these advances could influence a historical investigation. Evidence that had remained unresolved for many years could be reevaluated using modern laboratory methods. The scientific capabilities available in the 21st century allowed investigators to revisit questions that had remained unanswered since 1991. The investigation also became an example of the importance of correcting earlier conclusions when new evidence becomes available. During the late 1990s, for men, Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn became associated with the investigation. Some of them provided confessions, but those statements later became the subject of legal challenges. When DNA testing showed that biological evidence recovered from the crime scene did not match the individuals who had been accused, the previous prosecutions could not be sustained. This development represented a significant moment in the history of the case. The findings demonstrated that criminal investigations must remain based on reliable evidence and that conclusions may need to be revised when scientific analysis produces different results. The role of forensic science was not simply to support an existing theory, but to objectively evaluate the available evidence. Years later, continued advances in DNA analysis contributed to another major development. In 2025, investigators announced that Robert Eugene Brasher's had been identified as the individual most likely responsible for the murders. This conclusion was based on modern forensic analysis combined with ballistic evidence and the documented characteristics of the offense. Because Brasher's had died in 1999, the identification did not lead to a criminal trial. The circumstances surrounding this development demonstrate both the power and limitations of modern forensic investigation. Scientific advances made it possible to reach a conclusion that had remained unavailable for decades. However, the passage of time meant that traditional legal proceedings could not occur. The investigation therefore reached a resolution through forensic findings and official investigative conclusions rather than through a courtroom verdict. The legal system also addressed the consequences of the earlier accusations. In February 2026, the remaining accusations against the 4 previously charged men were formally dismissed. This action completed a process shaped by decades of forensic review and legal examination. It represented the final correction of the earlier prosecutions based on the evidence available after modern scientific analysis. The Austin Yogurt Shop investigation has become a reference point for discussions about wrongful accusations, forensic reliability, and the importance of evidence preservation. The case demonstrated that investigations must consider all available information carefully and that scientific evidence can play a decisive role in preventing unsupported conclusions from becoming permanent. The investigation also reinforced the value of maintaining evidence in unresolved cases. When a crime remains unsolved for many years, preserved evidence may become the key to future progress. Scientific methods continue to develop, and material that once provided limited information may later become highly valuable. The Austin case provides a clear example of how decisions made during an initial investigation can influence outcomes decades later. Beyond the scientific and legal aspects, the case remains historically significant because of its impact on the Austin community. The deaths of 4 young victims in a local business affected public awareness of safety and security. The investigation became part of the city's collective memory and remained a subject of public attention for many years. The case also demonstrated the long-term responsibilities associated with major criminal investigations. Solving complex cases often requires cooperation between different areas of expertise, including detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and legal authorities. The Austin investigation continued across multiple generations of professionals, each contributing to the preservation and examination of the case record. The history of the Austin Yogurt Shop murders illustrates that justice investigations do not always follow a simple or predictable path. Some cases are resolved quickly through immediate evidence and successful prosecution. Others require decades of technological advancement and continued examination before significant progress can be achieved. This investigation belonged to the second category, becoming a long-term example of persistence within the criminal justice system. The case also changed how many people view cold cases. An unresolved investigation is not necessarily a forgotten investigation. Cold cases can remain active through evidence preservation, periodic review, and the application of new scientific methods. The The Austin investigation demonstrates that time alone does not eliminate the possibility of future discoveries. At the same time, the case serves as a reminder of the importance of accuracy throughout every stage of an investigation. From the initial collection of evidence to later forensic analysis and legal review, each step influences the reliability of the final conclusions. The history of this case shows why investigators must remain open to new evidence and willing to reconsider earlier assumptions when objective findings require it. More than 30 years after the murders, the Austin yogurt shop case stands as one of the most significant examples of a cold case transformed by forensic science. Its history includes tragedy, investigative challenges, legal disputes, technological advancement, and eventual scientific progress. The case continues to be studied because it demonstrates both the difficulties of solving complex crimes and the ability of modern science to provide answers that were once impossible to obtain. The lasting importance of the investigation lies not only in the identification of a likely suspect, but also in the broader lessons it provides. The case emphasizes the importance of preserving evidence, maintaining investigative records, applying science objectively, and ensuring that legal conclusions remain connected to verified facts. The story of the Austin yogurt shop murders therefore represents more than a single investigation. It reflects the ongoing evolution of criminal justice and forensic science. It shows how evidence collected in the past can continue to contribute to the search for truth in the future, and how the pursuit of accurate answers may continue across generations. Through decades of investigation and scientific progress, the case became a powerful example of the enduring effort to understand complex crimes and preserve the integrity of the justice process. The Austin yogurt shop murders represent more than a single criminal case. Over the course of more than 30 years, the investigation became an example of how law enforcement, forensic science, and the legal system interact when attempting to resolve a complex and long-standing homicide. The case began with the deaths of 4 young victims inside a neighborhood business and developed into a historical examination of evidence, technology, investigative methods, and the challenges involved in seeking factual conclusions after many years have passed. The events of December 6, 1991, established the foundation for everything that followed. Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers were killed inside the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt store on West Anderson Lane in Austin. Investigators determined that the 4 victims had been shot and that the building was intentionally set on fire afterward. The fire was a central factor in the investigation because it damaged the crime scene and destroyed evidence that might have provided additional information. From the beginning, the case required a large investigative response. The Austin Police Department conducted extensive work to collect evidence, interview individuals with possible information, and establish the circumstances surrounding the crime. Thousands of leads were reviewed over time, and hundreds of interviews were conducted as investigators attempted to determine who was responsible. The investigation became particularly challenging because of the limited forensic opportunities available at the time. In 1991, DNA technology was not as advanced as it would become in later decades. Although biological evidence could be collected and examined, laboratories did not possess the same level of analytical capability that exists today. As a result, some questions that could not be answered at the time remained unresolved for many years. The decision to preserve evidence became one of the most important factors in the future of the investigation. Materials recovered from the original crime scene remained available for later examination as forensic science developed. This preservation allowed investigators decades later to apply new techniques to evidence collected during the earliest stages of the case. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of reviewing cases as scientific methods evolve. During the years following the murders, forensic science underwent major changes. DNA analysis became increasingly precise, allowing investigators to examine biological evidence in ways that were previously impossible. Many cold cases across the United States were reopened or advanced because older evidence could now be analyzed with improved methods. The Austin yogurt shop investigation followed this pattern. Evidence preserved from 1991 was repeatedly evaluated as new technologies became available. These examinations contributed to important developments, including the conclusion that DNA evidence did not match the individuals who had previously been accused during the late 1990s. The history of those earlier prosecutions became a significant part of the case. Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn had been identified as suspects during the investigation in 1999. Some individuals provided confessions, but those statements later became the subject of legal challenges. When DNA analysis showed that the biological evidence from the crime scene did not correspond with the accused individuals, the previous legal proceedings could not be sustained. This part of the investigation became an important example of how forensic evidence can influence the justice system. Scientific findings are designed to evaluate evidence objectively, even when those findings challenge earlier investigative conclusions. In the Austin case, DNA analysis prevented unsupported conclusions from becoming permanent and demonstrated the importance of relying on evidence that can withstand continued examination. The case remained unresolved until further forensic advances created a new investigative direction. In 2025, investigators announced that Robert Eugene Brasher's had been identified as the individual most likely responsible for the murders. This conclusion was reached through the use of modern DNA analysis combined with ballistic evidence and the documented characteristics of the crime. The announcement represented the most significant development in the investigation since the original murders. After decades without a confirmed resolution, investigators were able to present a conclusion supported by contemporary forensic methods. However, because Brasher's had died in 1999, the case could not proceed to a criminal trial. This circumstance shaped the final stage of the investigation. Instead of a courtroom proceeding determining legal responsibility, the resolution came through investigative findings and forensic analysis. The inability to conduct a trial reflected a practical limitation created by the passage of time. While science could provide new information about the evidence, it could not change the fact that the identified suspect was no longer available for prosecution. The legal consequences of the new findings also affected the individuals who had previously been accused. In February 2026, a Texas court formally dismissed the remaining accusations against the 4 men connected to earlier prosecutions. This action represented the final legal step in removing those unresolved accusations after forensic evidence demonstrated that the previous cases could not be supported. The outcome of the Austin investigation has contributed to broader discussions about the relationship between technology and justice. The case illustrates how advances in science can influence both the identification of responsible individuals and the correction of previous investigative outcomes. The same commitment to evidence-based analysis that led investigators to a new suspect also demonstrated why earlier conclusions must remain open to review when new facts emerge. The investigation has also become a significant example of the importance of maintaining cold case records. Major investigations often continue long after public attention decreases. Preserved evidence, detailed documentation, and careful record-keeping allow future investigators to continue the search for answers. Without these practices, technological advances may not be able to contribute effectively when new methods become available. The Austin yogurt shop case further demonstrates that criminal investigations are shaped by the technology and knowledge available at each point in history. Investigators in 1991 worked with the tools and methods available during that period. Later investigators benefited from decades of scientific progress. Each stage contributed to the eventual understanding of the case. The broader impact of the investigation extends into the field of forensic science education and criminal justice practice. The case provides an example of why evidence preservation, scientific evaluation, and careful legal review are essential components of reliable investigations. It demonstrates that conclusions reached during one period may change as new evidence becomes available, and that justice systems must have mechanisms to respond to those developments. The case also remains significant because of its effect on public awareness. The murders became one of the most recognized criminal investigations in Texas, receiving continued attention from media organizations and the public. The case remained part of discussions about unresolved crimes, forensic breakthroughs, and the ability of science to revisit historical investigations. However, the history of the case also reflects the limits of what investigators can accomplish. The fire that destroyed much of the crime scene created permanent gaps in the available evidence. Even with modern DNA technology and extensive investigative efforts, some details of the events inside the yogurt shop could never be fully reconstructed. The passage of time also affected the possibility of traditional legal proceedings. Despite these limitations, the investigation achieved a level of resolution that had not been possible for more than 30 years. Through preserved evidence, continued investigative work, and scientific advancement, authorities were able to provide the strongest available explanation for the crime. The case moved from a period defined by uncertainty toward a conclusion based on modern forensic findings. The Austin yogurt shop murders remain a landmark example of how cold cases can evolve over time. The investigation shows that unresolved crimes may continue to develop as technology improves and as evidence is reconsidered through new scientific methods. It also demonstrates that justice is not only about reaching a conclusion, but about ensuring that conclusions are supported by reliable and verifiable evidence. More than 3 decades after the murders, the case continues to represent both the challenges and possibilities of modern criminal investigation. It began as a devastating event in a local Austin business and became a national example of the long-term pursuit of answers. Its history demonstrates the importance of evidence preservation, the advancement of forensic science, and the responsibility of investigators and courts to follow the facts wherever they lead. The legacy of the Austin yogurt shop murders is therefore not limited to the events of one night in 1991. It is also the story of an investigation that continued across generations, adapted to new scientific realities, and demonstrated the enduring value of careful, evidence-based pursuit of the truth. The Austin yogurt shop murders remain one of the most significant criminal investigations in Texas history because the case represents the intersection of tragedy, investigative difficulty, legal review, and scientific advancement. The events that occurred on December 6, 1991, began as a local homicide investigation but developed into a decades-long examination of how criminal cases are investigated, challenged, and eventually reconsidered when new evidence becomes available. The confirmed facts of the original crime have remained consistent throughout the history of the investigation. On the night of December 6, 1991, 4 teenage girls were present at the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt store on West Anderson Lane in Austin. Jennifer Harbison, 17, and Eliza Thomas, 17, were working at the business. Sarah Harbison, 15, and Amy Ayers, 13, were visiting the location. Later that night, a fire was discovered at the store, and after firefighters extinguished the flames, the bodies of all 4 victims were found inside. Investigators determined that the victims had been killed by gunfire and that the fire had been intentionally set after the murders. This conclusion established the central facts of the investigation and shaped every subsequent effort to identify those responsible. The deliberate burning of the business created one of the greatest challenges of the case because it destroyed or damaged much of the physical evidence that investigators would normally rely upon during a homicide investigation. The difficulty of the crime scene influenced the entire direction of the investigation. Evidence collection had to be conducted under conditions in which many potential sources of information had already been compromised. Investigators worked to identify what material remained available and preserved those items for examination. The evidence collected during this early stage later became essential when scientific developments created new opportunities for analysis. The public response to the murders also became an important part of the case's historical significance. The killing of 4 teenagers in a neighborhood business shocked Austin and drew extensive attention throughout Texas. The investigation became one of the most closely followed criminal cases in the region, with residents and media organizations continuing to monitor developments over many years. The response from the community reflected the seriousness of the event. Families reconsidered safety practices, and businesses reviewed security measures. The murders affected public discussions about crime prevention and personal safety, particularly concerning young people working evening shifts. The case therefore became part of the broader social history of Austin, as well as its criminal justice history. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement officials conducted one of the largest homicide investigations in the city's history. Thousands of leads were collected and reviewed, and hundreds of individuals were interviewed. Investigators examined available physical evidence and continued searching for information that could identify the person or persons responsible. Despite these efforts, the investigation did not produce an immediate resolution. The limitations created by the fire, combined with the forensic capabilities available at the time, prevented investigators from reaching a definitive conclusion. The case eventually entered the category of a cold case, meaning that it remained unresolved despite extensive investigative work. The history of the case demonstrates the importance of preserving evidence in unresolved investigations. Although the original investigation could not identify the perpetrator, evidence collected in 1991 remained available for future scientific examination. This preservation allowed later investigators to revisit the case using technologies that had not yet reached their modern level of development. The advancement of DNA technology became a major factor in the investigation's later history. During the 1990s and early 21st century, DNA analysis became increasingly accurate and widely used in criminal investigations. These improvements changed the way law enforcement agencies approached older cases because evidence collected decades earlier could sometimes provide new information. The Austin case demonstrated both the power and the importance of this scientific development. DNA testing played a critical role in evaluating the suspects identified during the late 1990s. Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn became connected to the investigation in 1999. Some individuals provided confessions, but questions later emerged regarding the reliability of those statements. When DNA testing showed that biological evidence from the crime scene did not match the individuals who had been accused, the earlier prosecutions could not continue successfully. The legal outcomes associated with those accusations were overturned or dismissed. This development became a significant part of the case's history because it demonstrated the importance of scientific evidence in reviewing previous investigative conclusions. The investigation later entered another major phase when improved forensic methods allowed investigators to conduct additional analysis of preserved evidence. In 2025, authorities announced that Robert Eugene Brasher's had been identified as the individual most likely responsible for the murders. This conclusion was based on modern DNA analysis combined with ballistic evidence and the known characteristics of the crime. The announcement represented a major historical development because it provided the first evidence-based identification of a likely perpetrator after more than 30 years of investigation. However, the circumstances also prevented a traditional criminal trial because Brasher's had died in 1999. As a result, the case did not proceed through the normal process of prosecution and courtroom examination. The legal system continued addressing the consequences of the earlier prosecutions. In February 2026, a Texas court formally dismissed the remaining accusations against the 4 men previously connected to the investigation. This action completed the legal process of removing those accusations after forensic evidence demonstrated that the earlier cases could not be supported. The final stages of the investigation highlighted several important principles of criminal justice. First, evidence must remain the foundation of investigative conclusions. Second, scientific developments can require the justice system to reconsider earlier decisions. Third, preserving evidence allows future generations of investigators to examine historical cases with improved tools and methods. The Austin yogurt shop investigation also demonstrates how criminal cases can change meaning over time. In the years immediately following the murders, the case represented an unsolved crime that had deeply affected a community. During the late 1990s, it became associated with disputed prosecutions and questions regarding the reliability of confessions. Decades later, it became an example of how modern forensic science can reshape understanding of a historical investigation. The case has contributed to broader discussions about wrongful accusations and the importance of objective evidence. The experience of the investigation showed why confessions and allegations must be evaluated alongside physical evidence rather than considered independently. It also demonstrated why forensic methods must continue developing and why previously examined evidence may need to be reviewed when technology advances. The Austin yogurt shop murders also became an example of the challenges faced by investigators working on cold cases. Time can create obstacles, including the loss of witnesses, changes in technology, and the destruction or deterioration of evidence. At the same time, time can also provide new opportunities when scientific methods improve and previously unavailable forms of analysis become possible. The investigation's long history illustrates the relationship between past and present within criminal justice. The work of investigators in 1991 created the foundation that allowed later scientific examination. The forensic specialists of later decades relied on evidence preserved by earlier investigators. Prosecutors and courts then responded to the conclusions produced by these developments. Each stage of the process contributed to the final historical understanding of the case. Although the investigation reached a significant conclusion, the case remains a reminder of the limits of forensic science. Modern technology can analyze surviving evidence, but it cannot recover material permanently destroyed or recreate every detail of past events. The fire that followed the murders ensured that some information would remain unavailable despite decades of investigative effort. Nevertheless, the Austin Yogurt Shop murders stand as a powerful example of the continuing value of evidence-based investigation. The case demonstrates that unanswered questions may remain open for decades, and that scientific progress can provide new answers long after a crime has occurred. It also reinforces the importance of maintaining investigative records and preserving evidence even when immediate solutions are not possible. The historical significance of the case extends beyond the identification of a likely suspect. It represents a broader story about the evolution of criminal investigation in the modern era. It shows how law enforcement agencies, forensic scientists, and courts adapt when new information changes the understanding of a case. More than 30 years after the murders, the Austin Yogurt Shop investigation remains a defining example of a cold case transformed by science. It began with a devastating crime in a local business and continued through decades of investigation, legal challenges, and technological advancement. Its history demonstrates both the difficulties of solving complex crimes and the importance of continuing the search for accurate answers. The legacy of the Austin Yogurt Shop murders is ultimately connected to the principles that guided the investigation across generations: preserving evidence, evaluating facts objectively, applying scientific methods carefully, and allowing new discoveries to influence conclusions. The case remains an important part of Texas criminal history because it shows how justice investigations can continue evolving long after the original crime has entered history. The Austin Yogurt Shop murders remain a significant chapter in the history of criminal investigations in Texas because the case represents the challenges involved in pursuing answers across decades. From the night of December 6, 1991, through the investigative developments announced in 2025 and the legal actions completed in 2026, the case reflected the changing relationship between evidence, technology, and the justice system. The case began with a crime that immediately attracted widespread attention. 4 teenage girls were killed inside the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt store on West Anderson Lane in Austin. Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas were employees at the business, while Sarah Harbison and Amy Ayers were present at the location that evening. After the murders, the building was intentionally set on fire, creating a crime scene that was both severely damaged and difficult to investigate. The circumstances of the crime shaped every stage of the investigation that followed. Because the fire destroyed significant evidence, investigators faced limitations from the earliest days of the case. The available physical evidence had to be carefully collected and preserved, and investigators relied on the information that could be recovered from the damaged location. The investigation became one of the largest homicide investigations in Austin's history. Law enforcement officials reviewed thousands of leads, interviewed hundreds of individuals, and repeatedly examined evidence as investigative methods developed. Despite these efforts, the case remained unresolved for many years. The length of the investigation became one of the defining characteristics of the case. Unlike investigations that reach a conclusion shortly after a crime occurs, the Austin Yogurt Shop murders continued through multiple periods of technological change and legal review. The case demonstrated that some investigations require long-term commitment because the answers may depend on developments that do not yet exist at the time of the original crime. The role of evidence preservation became increasingly important as time passed. Materials collected during the initial investigation remained available for later examination. This allowed future investigators and forensic specialists to revisit questions that had remained unanswered during earlier stages of the case. The development of DNA technology transformed the investigation. During the decades following the murders, forensic science advanced significantly. DNA analysis became more precise and more widely used, allowing investigators to examine biological evidence with greater accuracy than was possible during the early 1990s. These scientific developments also affected the legal history of the case. In 1999, for men, Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn became associated with the investigation. Some provided confessions, but those statements later became the subject of legal challenges. When DNA testing showed that biological evidence from the crime scene did not match the individuals who had been accused, the previous prosecutions could not be maintained. This part of the investigation became an important example of how scientific evidence can change the direction of a criminal case. The findings demonstrated that investigative conclusions must remain connected to verified evidence and that previous decisions may need to be reconsidered when new scientific information becomes available. The later breakthrough in the investigation occurred because preserved evidence could be examined using improved forensic methods. In 2025, authorities announced that Robert Eugene Brasher's had been identified as the individual most likely responsible for the murders. Investigators stated that this conclusion was based on modern DNA analysis combined with ballistic evidence and the documented characteristics of the crime. The announcement marked a major development in the historical record of the case. After more than 30 years, investigators were able to present an evidence-based identification of a likely suspect. However, because Brasher's had died in 1999, the case could not proceed to a criminal trial. The investigation therefore reached its conclusion through forensic findings rather than a courtroom verdict. The legal consequences of the new findings continued into 2026. In February of that year, a Texas court formally dismissed the remaining accusations against the 4 men who had previously been connected to the case. This action reflected the impact of the updated forensic evidence and completed the legal process related to those earlier accusations. The history of the Austin yogurt shop murders has become closely connected with discussions about the importance of scientific accuracy in criminal investigations. The case demonstrates that evidence must be examined objectively and that conclusions should change when reliable information requires a different understanding of events. The investigation also illustrates the importance of reviewing older cases when new technologies become available. Across the United States, many cold cases have been reconsidered because advances in forensic science created opportunities that did not exist during the original investigations. The Austin case represents one example of this broader transformation within modern law enforcement. Another important aspect of the case is the relationship between past and present investigative methods. The investigators who worked on the case in 1991 collected and preserved evidence according to the standards available at that time. Later investigators used improved technology to analyze that same evidence. The final developments in the case were therefore the result of work performed across several generations. The investigation also became a reminder that criminal justice requires continuous evaluation. A case does not necessarily end when an initial investigation fails to produce a final answer. Instead, preserved evidence and documented records may allow future investigators to continue the search for verified information. The public memory of the Austin yogurt shop murders has been shaped by both the tragedy of the crime and the long process that followed. The case remained a subject of attention because it involved 4 young victims, an extensive investigation, unsuccessful prosecutions, and eventually a forensic breakthrough more than 3 decades later. The case also influenced broader discussions about the treatment of cold cases. It demonstrated why law enforcement agencies continue preserving evidence even when immediate solutions are unavailable. Future scientific advances may provide information that cannot be obtained through the technology available at the time of the original investigation. At the same time, the investigation shows the limitations faced by even the most advanced forensic methods. The fire that followed the murders permanently destroyed some evidence, leaving certain questions beyond the ability of investigators to answer. Modern science improved the understanding of the case but could not restore everything that had been lost. The Austin yogurt shop murders therefore remain an example of both progress and limitation within criminal investigations. Scientific development provided information that had not been available for decades, but the passage of time also prevented a traditional legal conclusion through a criminal trial. The case has also contributed to the historical understanding of how justice systems respond to uncertainty. Investigators, forensic specialists, and courts must work with the evidence available at each stage while remaining prepared to reconsider conclusions when new facts emerge. The Austin investigation demonstrated this process over an unusually long period. More than 3 decades after the murders, the case continues to be studied because it represents many of the central issues in modern criminal investigation: the importance of evidence preservation, the advancement of DNA technology, the evaluation of confessions, the correction of unsupported accusations, and the pursuit of reliable conclusions. The legacy of the Austin yogurt shop murders is therefore not limited to the identification of a likely suspect. It also includes the lessons learned about how investigations develop over time. The case shows that scientific progress can transform unresolved questions into evidence-based conclusions, and that careful investigative work may continue producing results long after a crime has entered history. The story of the Austin yogurt shop murders remains a significant part of Texas criminal history because it demonstrates the enduring importance of evidence, technology, and persistence. From the original investigation in 1991 to the forensic developments of 2025 and the legal actions of 2026, the case reflects the continuing effort to establish facts and preserve the integrity of the justice process.